For those who are watching this message on my YouTube channel, this message was expressly made for the Gilead Bible Church in San Ramon, California. But of course, we invite everyone to be able to listen to any content that I have on my channel. For those at Gilead Bible, you know that I generally schedule a message well in advance in terms of a series that we've been going through, and for the most part, we've been going through the book of Luke. However, as I scheduled this well in advance, there is no more appropriate Sunday for this message and the topic that we will discuss as this Sunday and all the things that we have been going through this past week. So it's my hope that you are both blessed and challenged by the message today. Now, for those who have heard me live, you know I normally take about 40 to 45 minutes, far too long than I care to take when I give a message at Gilead Bible Church. Yet when we distill it down to a video message that comes on YouTube, taking out the ahs and ums, taking out the ramblings as well as the repeatings of things, what I've noticed is that shrinks down to about 15 minutes. Now, you have already given me feedback to say, can you make it a little longer than that? Can you make it 30 minutes? So I will attempt that today. And as I was trying to think of how am I going to attempt that, is that in this message, you're probably going to be able to hear a little bit more of what my thinking was all about when I thought of a specific point or I interpreted a certain passage. So my hope is that you get inside my mind and understand, and hopefully will develop your own perspective on how you would approach this passage yourself. And for those of you who are YouTube viewers on a regular basis to any sermon or message that is out there, you know the magic of being able to fast forward or get to the next point, which, you know, I'll admit I do myself. So my hope is whether it's a short message for you or an expanded message that here's where I'm coming from, my hope is that you will, again, be blessed and challenged today. The message for today is entitled Called to Break Barriers. It's found in Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Starting in verse 10, on a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, "Woman, you are set free from your infirmity." Then he put his hands on her, and immediately she straightened up and praised God. Indignant, because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, "There are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath." The Lord answered him, "You hypocrites! Doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Then should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her?" When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was doing. Allow me to take you through this passage one more time, in my own words. First of all, we see Jesus is teaching in the synagogue. And as he's teaching in the synagogue, he is not just totally focused, but actually is perceiving of what is going on in the crowd. And, you know, I think that just speaks to his work ethic, is that in addition to his ability to impart knowledge on someone else, you know, trying to speak as in perspective of us as teachers, how much are we perceiving of how receptive the audience is, the crowd is to what we have to say, or what else that might be going on? I know I often get distracted by any little thing that goes on. And so I have tried to get better at not only focusing, but also sensing what else is going on. As I teach, and it's awfully difficult when you're doing it in this way because you can't see the audience, you can't see how they're reacting. But I tried to get better at sensing what are the things that I'm saying that might be relevant and impactful to folks that I'm talking to. That could be in a conversation. That could be in a setting as Jesus was in, a teaching, lecturing type of forum. But, I found it interesting that Jesus was sensing what else was going on. And he sensed this woman that was out there. It says that the woman was bent over, stooped, disabled. And he observed that. It says that she's been disabled for 18 years. Now, I don't think she was 18 years old. I think most likely, and I can't find any commentary that tells me one way or the other, what is this woman's age? But you can almost suspect that maybe what happens is as she got into adult life, that at that time she became disabled. Who knows what? We know that somehow, as we read in the passage, that it says that she was afflicted by Satan because she's obviously disabled and suffering. And he heals her in a very interesting way. And most of us would probably just take for granted that this is just another healing. But he does something that's interesting. He speaks to her, then he touches her. He guides her up. I've read in commentaries where they're saying the word that he spoke represents his power. The fact that he guided her to straighten out and his touch represents his compassion. How we need to have in our ministry, in whatever we do, in our servant leadership or in our servanthood, that word of encouragement, that power that we can give to somebody else, but also that compassion that we would have for them. And I thought that's just a message in itself, in that how he healed this woman was through his voice and through his touch. The next thing that I notice is as he heals her, as we've seen in other cases, the religious people are watching in all this. And as they're watching, what we see is the synagogue ruler speaks out. This is the part I want you to see. He doesn't speak to Jesus and rebuke him. He rebukes the woman. Basically, he says to her, "Why'd you come here to be healed on this day?" And basically throws the book at her, not to Jesus. And I wonder if he did this because he knew he could not argue with Jesus. But he can pick on somebody that is lower than him. I've said to you before about as we look at the Bible, the thing that I learn more about is how Jesus was gentle with people and really called out the bullies of the world. And I want you to notice that phrase, a daughter of Abraham. Why did he use this phrase, a daughter of Abraham? I'd like to be able to share that with you later on in one of the points, but I just want you to note it for now. Most of us who have read this passage before see it as a call out, a story regarding legalism and Jesus calling it out and speaking against legalism by what he practices. But as I look at this passage, I think there's a lot more to it than just that. It's not just a lesson on legalism. It really is a lesson on the barriers that are perceived at the time and Jesus breaking through those barriers, which is what he calls us to do now. The first barrier that he calls out and breaks through, I believe, is the gender race barrier. I'll show you in a little bit where I find that in the passage, but before I do, let's talk about the gender race barrier, which is very, very appropriate for us today. Many of us experienced a very proud moment this past week. I believe it was on Saturday and Sunday, where we saw SpaceX, Dragon SpaceX, launch into space, the first U.S.-made aircraft that was launched into space on U.S. soil in over 9 years. And so we saw that not only successfully launch, but successfully dock with the International Space Station. Again, a proud moment. But our country during this same time has seen some very ugly moments as well. The situation with George Floyd and the police brutality that was inflicted upon him such that he died of asphyxiation, and the protests, the subsequent protests that have happened and are continuing to happen, that draws fear and anger in our society today. But what brings it all together for me in these two events is this movie that was released back in 2016, Hidden Figures. The story of Hidden Figures is a story about a lady named Katherine Johnson. She's basically the star of the movie. Katherine Johnson was a mathematician. She served for NASA in the 60s. And during that time, as you could, for those of you who have lived in the 60s, you know that the African American race, as well as women, were not looked upon favorably. So for her to achieve that level of intelligence and prominence in NASA, to be their key mathematician, to be able to analyze the trajectory of the rocket ship. And if you watch the movie, you'll see that Alan Shepard basically says, I don't want anyone to do the calculations or recalculations of the rocket ship except for Katherine Johnson. It's just a remarkable achievement. And for those of you who didn't know, Katherine Johnson passed away this past year. She was 101 years old. At 97 years old, she received the Medal of Honor by President Barack Obama at the time. But the story in the movie, as it portrays her story, is just amazing. It brings together that space exploration, but also what we see at that time, the whole idea of race and gender barrier. And Katherine Johnson struggled to break through that. As you watch the movie, for those of you who haven't watched the movie, you'll see another struggle within that gender race barrier, in that she has to trek all the way across the NASA campus to be able to find a restroom that she's able to use, because they had segregated it based on colors versus whites. And, as I think about that now, it almost seems impossible, that we lived in an era that treated people that way. And so we've made some, I would say, some significant achievements along the way from the time that we had in the 60s. But as you see today, we've not nearly made enough. And the highlight for us through this passage that is relevant for us today is Jesus was calling out racism. Racism back then that they had during that time, and racism that still exists today, both in terms of race, though, as well as gender. And, as we look at this passage, this is what I see. And we'll go through the passage one more time. But I want you to notice that as he mentions this whole concept of the daughter of Abraham, it was almost, in a way, cleverly sarcastic. In that Jesus says, you wouldn't want this woman that's a daughter of Abraham to be disabled anymore, would you? Now look at this passage again. Then should not this woman, Jesus speaking, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath day from what bound her? When he said this, all his opponents were humiliated, but the people were delighted with all the wonderful things he was saying. I wonder if the opponents were humiliated for two reasons. One, that Jesus basically showed them up by healing this lady who was inflicted with this disability. But also, I wonder if they were humiliated because it pointed out their own bigotry. Jesus saying it in almost a sarcastic way is cleverly stating it as if it were pointing out their nationalism. Rather, what we see is it actually reveals what's truly in their heart, which is bigotry. And I wonder if in our world, in our society, you can not just talk about our government, but all governments through history, is that what we call nationalism is or patriotism may actually be bigotry that we would have for other people that aren't like us. And that's a fine line that we need to be careful about. The next barrier that we see is the disability barrier. We observe that the lady was stooped over and Jesus healed her of her disability so that she was able to straighten out once again. Here's another innovation that we have taken for granted, another initiative that we've taken for granted. And that is, as you can see on the sidewalk here, how it dips down. There's actually a name for that. It's called a curb cut. And my understanding is that it was first initiated back in 1945 by disabled veterans. It was an initiative to build this curb cut into the sidewalk, but it really didn't take full effect until the 60s. And I only discovered this by reading an article on innovation. It had to do about a guy named Ed Roberts. He was a student at UC Berkeley back in the 60s, and his wheelchair showed up somewhere in the Smithsonian Institute in one of the basements. And so when they finally discovered this wheelchair and realized that what was the significance of this, what's the story behind this wheelchair, they discovered the whole story of Ed Roberts. As a student at UC Berkeley, he apparently was able to get into UC Berkeley even though he was disabled with an iron lung. So he had a hard time breathing, and he had to figure out a way of breathing to be able to sustain himself, to focus, to concentrate on his schoolwork. And so he came up with this way that of breathing, basically holding his breath and releasing it. I just can't imagine how it's done the way frogmen do it. And so he came up with this technique of breathing. He was able to actually denied once and then finally got into UC Berkeley. And it was during that time that he was in UC Berkeley that he got together with other fellow students, folks that were also in his dorm. And they devised an idea of building these curb cuts. Now, obviously, Ed Roberts couldn't do this himself, but he had the help of his friends to be able to on a daily or a nightly basis at midnight, they would go and basically jackhammer and blast open sidewalks on the corners to build these curb cuts. And over time, they were able to build 125 curb cuts in Berkeley. And again, it was done primarily at midnight. And most of us look at a curb cut and we think that was something so that I can roll my rolling suitcase or my shopping cart or whatever other thing with wheels on it, and it's benefited us. And the moral to this story really is that what actually was a benefit or an initiative for folks that are disabled actually became good for everyone. That's not the first time this has happened. In that same article that I read, what we see is the whole concept of our American football huddle actually started because I think it was the California School of the Deaf needed a way to be able to somehow communicate the plays to each player prior to actually snapping the ball. And so they came up with this idea of all huddling around and someone would sign the plays. And as we see, there isn't although there is a no huddle offense, for the most part, there's still a huddle today with American football. In fact, we've taken that term and now used it in the secular world, in industry, where we call our short meetings huddles. And really, as we look at these things that have benefited one class of or group of people that are disadvantaged, what we see is that it's become an innovation for everyone. Let's go back and look at the passage. It says, on a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. Are we as observant as Jesus was to notice those around us who can't stand straight, who are impaired in some way? The next barrier is the legalism barrier. Not much needs to really be said on this because the story pretty much speaks for itself in that Jesus healed on the Sabbath. However, when we bring that forward into our day, what is the legalism that we experience today? Is it perhaps us doing church or ministry a certain way and to say that we've always done it this way? And there's some merit to that, to be able to bring across the traditions that we've had that in the past. But I believe there is a fine line between what is considered legacy versus what is considered legalism. So as we can see, it's cited here in Scripture. Indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue ruler said to the people, there are 6 days for work, so come and be healed on those days and not on the Sabbath. Now, it goes to be said that the Sabbath is important, that we have a pause in our work so that we can rest. Jesus rested. God the Father as creator rested. And so the pattern is set for us to also pause from what we are doing to reflect on his goodness in our lives, to perhaps refocus. And so I want to emphasize that, yes, the Sabbath is important, but as it's used here, it was used as a tool or a weapon to basically beat down on this woman. So as much as it is an aid for us and a practice for us in regards to the Sabbath, we need to be careful with the practices that we have as to whether we're using them in the proper way and not as a weapon to degrade other people. Now, in the denomination that I'm a part of, which many of you also know of or have been a part of, which is the Christian and Missionary Alliance, we believe in this concept of the fourfold gospel. It was originated by a guy named A.B. Simpson, who actually who actually started the Christian and Missionary Alliance. And in this concept, basically what it states is that Jesus Christ is our King, which is represented by the crown. He's our Savior, which is represented by the cross. And he's our sanctifier, which is represented by the goblet on the right side. But the fourth element, which is often downplayed, though it deserves equal weight, is Jesus as our healer. And that's represented by the pitcher. A.B. Simpson wasn't always a believer in Jesus as healer. He started out as a frail child, and when he got to a point in his life early on, 14, he was actually able to somehow better his health such that he ended up going to preaching school where he studied. And as he did that, he was a hard worker, so hard of a worker that he would work himself to exhaustion, almost to the point where he said in his own words that he was ready to die at 14 years old. Somehow God brought him out of that situation, which he eventually became a well-known pastor, ended up pastoring a very large church in New York. Actually, he started out in Canada, where he had the second largest church. Ended up going to New York, and And again, the pattern continued where he worked himself to exhaustion. And at 37 years old, his doctors told him he would die. Okay, and with such dire news, he ended up going off to Europe, trying to recover in some way, but apparently his fate was to be determined. However, he somehow got healed from that situation. And as he went back into ministry, there was a situation where there was a boy who was very sick, and the mother had asked him to come and pray over the boy that he might be healed. He didn't think much of it and thought, well, I will do the perfunctory prayer of healing for this young man, and left. And as he had left, apparently the boy got healed. He confirmed with the doctor, well, this is some kind of miracle. And the doctor said, this happens all the time. Don't think much of it. Basically dismissing what his prayer had done. Yet over his ministry, time and time again, he saw that this healing prayer somehow miraculously healed people. He continued to study scripture and discovered for himself that Jesus truly is the healer. A.B. Simpson claimed this passage, James chapter 5, verse 15, where it says, "And the prayer offered in faith will make the sick person well. The Lord will raise them up. If they have sinned, they will be forgiven." 18% of Jesus' works were actually on healing. And so we can't dismiss what healing can actually do in our present day. As we go back to today's passage of Scripture and cite this passage on healing, we see that there was clearly a situation where he healed her, that he put his hands on her and immediately she straightened up and praised God. There was no other medical care or anything else that was offered, so we can only ascribe this to miraculous healing. So in our remaining time, maybe we need to consider, first of all, are we barriers? Where have we been barriers in situations like this? And what can we do to then break those barriers? Let's look at the practical things that we can do so that we can break barriers and not be barriers. The first barrier that we can break is by calling it out. When we call out those barriers that stand in our way, that oppress people, and we identify that's courageous. And then what's more is if we can highlight those situations where people have spoke up, that have raised their hand, that have said this is not fair, we need to be able to share those good stories where someone else was courageous. The next thing is to feel for the oppressed. And that means to have empathy, to be able to put yourself in their shoes. It's easy to be able to look at the folks, some of them that are protesters and even some of those that are looting, and say that I am so angry. How could they ever do something like that? But it's probably another story or another perspective is you start to sense their anger, especially if it's a situation where they've lost their job. Perhaps, yes, they don't have to pay the rent, but they'll have 3 months of rent that they'll have to pay in 3 months without a job. And their child is at home because they can't go to school, so they have to be both a parent and somehow a breadwinner, which they don't have a job for. It's understood. When you put yourself in that perspective, it's understood why they are so angry, not just at what is going on, but probably just in general angry at the world. By now you might have figured out that the points that I'm bringing out here as to how we can break barriers parallel the points that I brought out earlier. First of all, that of being the gender race barrier and how that parallels with how we can have courage in calling it out. Second one is that of disability and how we can learn to empathize and feel for what it feels like in their shoes. And now on this one, living the principle, that parallels the one on legalism. The fact that so often we may just do things because that's the way we've always done it. Often we think of doing work right, when really what we should be doing is doing the right work. And now the final way that we can break barriers is to model it boldly. How does that parallel the healing barrier? Well, if you think about what Jesus did, it wasn't so much the healing as much as it was freeing the woman to live the life that she could live. And so healing really is a means to an end. That end is enabling freedom. And it doesn't take us praying for healing, which we should, to enable freedom for those that are around us, for those that are hurting, that we can enable them to be free of whatever hurt they might be going through, whether it could be physical, but it could be emotional or spiritual as well. I close with this final story. Many of you have probably watched or have been watching the PBS special on Asian Americans. And as I was watching that, I saw another show that caught my eye called Asian Flavors. And it was there that they talked about the Twin Cities and how Asian cuisine was introduced into that area. It started back in 1883, and this is depicted one of the two Wu brothers who had gone to the Minneapolis area, or actually I think it's Duluth is where he ended up going to, and starting a restaurant there, which was later named John's Place. And I like how they characterized it. They said that during that time there was, as is today, a lot of racial tensions between whites and blacks. And the Asians during that time served as a bridge, offering up their special type of cuisine, which was enjoyed by both whites and blacks. And it reminds me that, and I've watched other documentaries in other parts of the countries that have said the same thing, that our Asian ancestors have been that bridge because we were neither identified as white or black. Many times that worked to our detriment, but there were times where it worked to our benefit, to be that bridge between the two races which continue to have racial tensions to this day. As we close today and consider how we can break barriers, these barriers that still exist, back in Jesus' time, that still exists today, may we also consider what we're feeling right now in this situation. Perhaps you, like I, have felt angry about all the things that have gone on, and we feel justified in that anger because God was angry in his righteous indignation. Jesus was angry as he overturned the money changers' tables, and we think that justifies us being angry. And maybe it does if we are able to act on that anger and come up with a solution. But if our solution is just complaining to our friends and family, then we've really not acted on that anger like Jesus, like God the Father have. And that's where I would offer to you, as what I've been trying to practice for myself, is to find a better way and to say to ourselves that I'm choosing not to be angry. Because what we see in our situation, and this is very much the situation, is that anger just begets more anger. Anger that perhaps the police officer felt for those people who were breaking the law begets the anger, and I think he even admitted the mistake that he made. And anger that comes in the protest that then involves looting and people being hurt that are store merchants begets more anger. And so we get in this endless cycle of anger. My hope is that we find a better way. That for us, for you and I, anger shouldn't beget anger. That rather than being angry, that we choose to understand and we choose to be the bridges as our ancestors, and for many of you that are old enough, your friends, your colleagues, your family members were bridges during that time of racial tension. We did that. Our ancestors have done that have lived here in this country. And my hope is that we can do that as well. To be the bridge when it comes to racial tension, to be the bridge when it comes to disabilities, to see that disabilities can actually foster innovation and to also bring healing, not just physical healing, but spiritual healing to those around us. Thanks for watching today.